Okay then, so hopefully that screen is up and working for everyone. Thank you, Michael, and thank you to Sage for hosting the session. So in the next 15 minutes, I'm just going to kind of set up the scene of this subject, the art and science of data visualization. In particular, I'm going to be looking to give some pointers towards what makes a good data visualization. To start things off, a proposed definition of this subject. And this is my working definition: the representation and the presentation of data to facilitate understanding. So what does that mean? Well, data, first of all, is the raw material. This is the means through which we create the portrayals of data and communicate these to others, to an audience. And obviously, depending on the state, the shape, the size, the condition of your data, there'll be many different things that you can find and explore and discover and then share those insights with your audience. The representation of that data is effectively the chart types. How do you show, how do you visually represent the values and the variables of data that you're trying to show? And there are many, many chart types out there, something that Stephanie will be covering later on. The presentation of data is all the other things, all the other design choices that go into the execution of a visualization project. The potential for interactivity, of course, it is entirely optional and based on the format of your final work, but interactivity is one of the design layers to think about. Annotation, the layer of assistance, if you like, labels, captions, intros, anything that you need to give your audience assistance with, an explanation about, that is a form of annotation. Colour, anything that you can see has a property of colour. So it's not just the colours of the values in the charts, but anything that you present on your project, your graphic, your interactive digital needs to be thought about very carefully. And then last but not least, the composition. How do you arrange all these different elements? The sizing, the placement, the layout of your final piece. To facilitate understanding is the game that we're in. It's about finding a way to impart some sense of understanding to your audience, which could be anything from a Hollywood moment of discovery right through to the single grain of extra little bit of knowledge about a subject that might not have any immediate direct action or decision tied to it, but someone just knows something more about a subject or has had something reinforced about a subject. And of course, data visualization comes in many different forms. Whether it's a digital project, increasingly these days the platforms and the technology that we have enable these wonderfully rich interactives to exist. Whether it's an infographic in a newspaper, on a poster, whether it's many charts comprising a report or a slide deck, or indeed a video graphic. It doesn't really matter what the end result looks like. It is still the same underlying pursuit. And it's a pursuit of decision making. To make the best decisions, you need to be familiar with all your options and aware of the things that will influence your choices. The decisions are the moments where you have a choice to make. Which chart to use, which colours to use, which features of interactivity could you use. The options are the repertoire of things that you yourself can make happen, the chart types that you can make happen, the interactive features that you can actually integrate. The things that you will do are the things that you actually choose to do, and there are many influencing factors that shape your choices. And one of the important ways to tackle any visualization is to organize your thinking into a systematic approach. So this is a 4-stage workflow that I use in my own work that allows me to make effective decisions efficiently. And efficiently is very important because we have timescales. And the deadlines that we're facing are part and parcel of this first stage, formulating your brief. The requirements, the constraints, the triggers, the motivations, the reason why you're doing a visualization in the first place is our first concern. Who is it for? Who is the audience? Who's involved? What format is it intended for? All these things are very quick and simple things to gather, but they will have a great bearing and influence on your final decisions. The data stage comes next. Gathering, examining, exploring and transforming your data to get it into shape for your analysis, but also acquainting yourself with the shape and the structure and the potential of your data. What does it give you in terms of insights yourself to then allow you to choose what to show to others? And that's the essence of the third stage. What will we actually show to our audience? And I and many others in the field often think about this pursuit in the sense of photography. In a sense, a chart is a photograph of your data. So where will you point your camera towards? Which angle will you take your data from? Do you need multiple angles? Do you need a map and a line chart to look around data from every perspective that's interesting? What will be included and what will be excluded from your final work? And that is such an influencing stage because it is the bridge between the second stage of data and the fourth stage of design thinking. And the decisions involved here involve those 5 layers I described: the chart types, the color usage, the interactivity, the features of annotation and composition. We effectively start off with a blank slate, a blank piece of paper, a blank screen, and then the eventual outcome is a consequence of all those design choices that we make. And they are informed by those previous 3 stages, but also informed by some other things that are very influential. Principles. And we need principles because there is no perfect in visualization. That's why we see this as a process, not as a procedure. There is never a singular perfect outcome that we can pursue because there's all sorts of grey, soft edges. A lot of people in the field talk about the always and the nevers, but actually, invariably, things are much more nuanced and require much more sophisticated convictions to give you that sense of what's the right judgment to make in your own context. And so, to help my own thinking in this game, I use 3 key principles. Trustworthy, accessible and elegant. These are the things that I use to check if my work is ticking all the right boxes. So let me explain some of the ideas behind each of these 3 key principles. First of all, trustworthy, and the subtle distinction between trustworthy and trusted. Trust is something that we can struggle to achieve but very quickly lose with visualization. And there are many ways that we can actually lie with visualizations, whether we intend to or not. There's a book called How to Lie with Stats, it's a classic book by Darrell Huff. And there's a chapter in there that talks about the gee-whiz graph, and this is a collection of different ways that we can distort charts to effectively lie and deceive people. Here's a collection of some classic examples of bad visualizations that lie, whether they intend to or not. They lie for the distortion of shape calculations, area calculations, truncated axes, expanded axes when they distort the true trends of a line, and then absolute nonsense in the sense of a number that's larger being lower than the number that is smaller. And God bless Fox News for all that work. Here's one of the classic examples of one of the most kind of prominent no-nos in this field. The truncated value axis for bar charts. When we look at bar charts, we're perceiving the full length, the true length of the line or the height of a line portrayed. The example on the left shows a range of values that are similar in size. And so the length of the bars are also similar in size because that's the true value. When you truncate the quantitative axis on the right, beginning at 50, you distort the length of those values by making the top values seem enormous and the bottom values seem far smaller. Even with the labels there, our initial impression of those values is truly distorted. And numbers carry a veneer of authority and objectivity, but there is no objective in visualization. And I've highlighted that quote again. You make decisions, you make choices. There's all sorts of stages of choices from gathering, analysing, preparing and visualising your data that are editorial. And so we need to make sure that what we present to people is trustworthy. Now this is, in some ways, an extreme example of seeking to achieve and sustain that trust, giving people a sense of what's not there, what assumptions have been made, what's been done to the data. This project was produced by the LA Times graphics team a few weeks ago to mark the end of Kobe Bryant's basketball career, and this shows 30,699 shots plotted around the court to give you a sense of the patterns of his career. At the bottom you'll notice highlighted, you might not be able to read it, but it says that 2 shots were not included in this analysis. So just 2 shots. So they've gone to the extreme left to say that there are 2 shots missing. It doesn't distort the view, but they want to give you all the mental equipment you need to make the true interpretations that you might make from this display. The second principle is good visualization design is accessible. And this is about trying to minimize friction of the reader between the act of and the reward of understanding. And so it's about designing your visualization to make sure that the key things stand out and the things that are of less importance are perhaps pushed more into the background. If everything shouts, nothing's heard. So in this dashboard, and you can see it perhaps better on the small thumbnail view of the mobile phone, the yellow dots are intentionally prominent and vivid. They are the key things to look at first and foremost. The red dots are of secondary importance, and so they're a little bit more subdued in contrast to the yellow. The grey dots are almost insignificant, but they're still visible should you wish to create that third tier of comparison. And it's not about simplicity. Simplicity in design, ideally yes, but not simplicity in the subject matter. Some things are complex, and maybe the portrayal of that data is intending to show the complexity. The world's financial crisis is a mess. And so this graphic by the New York Times portrays all the different actors and relationships and influencers in this very complex model of financial flow and relationships. That's the point that is being made. If you simplified it any further, it would lose the essence of this underlying story. Some things are simple. Beard analysis can only ever be so complex. And so you design something that is therefore available to be consumed in 5 or 10 seconds. Some techniques are familiar. The length of a bar judgment is a very common method that we see in many charts, and so judging the minimum and maximum temperatures in this chart is very straightforward for most people. A pair of chord diagrams with all sorts of connections and flows between the different trade partners around the world is going to be complex because there's a lot of different moving parts. So again, it might be the right chart type, and it might not be immediate for the readers, but that sometimes is contextually appropriate. And so sufficiently accessible is a judgment based on what is the right solution for the context of the audience and the subjects that you have. The final principle is perhaps the hardest to explain, because you notice elegance more when it is absent. But the 3 components I believe that make up elegance in visualization are, first of all, good editing. Challenging everything. Don't just go for the motions. Just because you've got spatial data doesn't mean to say that a map is the best way to portray that data. In this example, there's a map there for reference, but the real data portrayal is through those kind of surrounding line charts. That's the main interesting story of this data. The visual harmony, it comes through experience and practice and exposure. It's about this unity between the surface aesthetic that's appealing, that's elegant, attractive, but that also preserves the clarity, the accuracy of the presented content. And good elegance, good visual harmony feels balanced. It feels like it's been very carefully conceived, the colours, the arrangement, the typography. Everything works together. The whole is greater than the sum of all the parts. It's about getting rid of the clutter, about removing things that you don't need. It's not about minimalism, that's too brutal. It's about making sure that you create some sense of allowing data to breathe, allowing us to see the data without any impedance from unnecessary chart apparatus, as you see in this display. And thoroughness. Taking care of every last visual detail. Everything that you leave on a screen, on a page, should be justifiable. It should be there for a reason. And so decision making is such an important aspect of thinking about developing your capabilities in visualization. And my sense of the kind of cycle that we go through can be summarized in this slide here. Novice designers are able to make suitable choices from a limited array of options, but maybe can't explain their reasons. Intermediate designers can explain their reasons, but they've still got a limited array of options. Advanced visualization designers are able to make the best choices from a wider array of options and can also justify their reasons. But the very elite in this field can make the best choices from unlimited options. They can create anything that they wish, any chart type, any interaction, but they can also justify and reason why they've done and why they've chosen those things. And that's the cycle that we're trying to strive towards. And that's certainly the journey that I try and get across in this upcoming book, due out in a few weeks' time. And just to point out that with the book is a lot of free digital resources to anyone, not just book readers themselves, that will go through all sorts of reading materials, exercises, and also a further case study that talks about this process, workflow in a lot more detail. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy, for that excellent presentation. I hope our webinar is accessible and elegant as your examples. Now we're going to hear from Stephanie Evergreen, who is pulling up her slides now.
Great, thanks so much. And while Andy showed us what great visuals look like, I'm going to show what data presentations typically look like. I'm so sick of seeing data presented like this. This comes from a blog post that was the top 10 worst data visualizations published in peer-reviewed research in the last decade, and this is bad. But I used to make stuff just like this. I have a PhD in interdisciplinary research, so I made things like this for years, and I gave them to my clients expecting that they would understand. And, you know, we're here kind of able to make fun of this, and that's sort of the point. We get so lost in this that we kind of just give up and laugh and enjoy the absurdity of the whole thing. But that same feeling we have when we see these visualizations is akin to the way that others feel when they look at our reporting. That we're so complicated and nerdy, it's laughable and absurd. And that is not how we get our data used. So sometimes we evolve from a table into a graph. This one also comes from that same blog post, and it's pretty bad, right? The most that I can tell when I look at this is Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Vietnamese, which is interesting enough that I want to learn more, but that's about as far as I can go. And when we do this to our readers, we put them in a position where we make them feel like they are just too stupid to understand us. They think, well, if I just knew what fixed bin distribution histogram for two loci meant, then I would be able to understand this graph. And when we have put our audiences in a position where they feel too stupid to understand us, we're not going to get our data used. This stuff happens in real life too, not just in peer-reviewed journal articles. This is fake data from a real client of mine, Verizon. And the before is what they were showing. And their bosses were upset. That's why they brought us in, because they felt like they were wasting so much time, rounds and rounds of interaction, they said, just to figure out what the data was trying to say. If you look at this before example, it's really just 3 pieces of information. They're talking about 3 different products here. Believe it or not, the blue bars in the bar graph connect with the blue lines in the line graph, even though the blue lines don't always touch the blue bars. Isn't that bananas? Totally. And the blue bars are product 1. They connect to the product 1 that's in the table, and that connects to the product 1 bullet points down below. I mean, it's just a mess. So all we did was reorganize the information that was on the slide so that the stuff that belongs together hangs together. We put those bullet points as annotations right on those lines. We use some of those data viz principles that Andy was talking about, where we've got some action colors working for us here, and we have a title that encapsulates the takeaway point. So as a result of this whole visual overhaul, a lot of cool things happened. The boss was still upset, but in a different way. He was mad now because he could actually see the places where performance wasn't great. But that led to actionable decision making. They said their weekly meetings were shorter and more to the point, and they had database decisions made by the end. The boss said they've got better decisions, more clarity, less top-down, more true interaction, leading to a richer team culture. All that from some data visualization. So we're talking about changing the visuals so that we can change the conversation, so that we can change the whole culture. So let's talk about one piece of making great data viz, and that is choosing the right chart type. A lot of us get stuck at this stage. And now it's going to be time for a little activity. So get out some scrap paper, pencil, whatever you happen to have around you. I don't care. I've got water here. I'll use my water for this activity, okay? I'm going to show you these two percentages, and I'm going to give you about 30 seconds. I want you to visualize these in some way. Use whatever is around you at your computer, whatever is on hand, but you've only got 30 seconds. And I want you to quickly make it, visualize it however you need to, and then type into the chat box or the question box and tell us what you made. So use whatever is at your disposal, visualize these two percentages, and then tell us what you did in the chat box. We've got some people saying bar graph. We've got lots of people saying pie charts. We've got a Kit Kat bar. Sure, I've seen that graph. That's a good one. What else can you do? A circle with a quarter cut out, a stacked bar. Jelly beans, sure, maybe 75 in one pile and 25 in another pile. Sure, good. Okay, a histogram, sure. Lots of choices that you have here. So how do we make a decision among all of those choices about what we're going to use? Well, the answer comes down to a couple of things. First of all, it's going to depend on what our audience needs from us. If we're going to an academic conference and we're talking to scientific peers, it probably needs to be something really scientific looking, like a bar chart. Sure, at that stage, go ahead and show them confidence intervals with jackknife standard errors. No problem, go ahead. But if we're trying to engage another crowd, people in the public, take them some jelly beans. Show them these two things as Kit Kat bars. That's how they're going to get engaged. You could probably take Kit Kat bars to your scientific conference, too. You can decide how well that's going to go over. But for audiences who are more scared of data, we don't want to make them feel stupid, so we might need to find some other ways to engage them. Okay, so part of your decision here is going to be what your audience needs from you. Another part of it is going to depend on audiences' brains. So I'm going to tell you the brain research back here. This comes from Cleveland and McGill. Cleveland is one of the grandfathers of data visualization, and he had this theory about what chart types people interpret the most effectively. And so he got together with McGill, and they ran a lot of little studies, mainly on college students, to try to figure out how this hierarchy was going to shake out. And this is it. Okay, so up at the top of the hierarchy, they said the easiest thing for human brains to interpret is position on a common scale, which is like dots on a line, which is a little confusing because we don't really see that very much. Next best, they said position on non-aligned scales. So we're still talking about dots. They can even be in two separate graphs as long as the scale or the y-axis is the same. Okay, well, let's keep going. Down below that, they said length and then direction and then angle. So length is where we get bar charts and column charts. Direction is where we're going to get line graphs. And angle is where we get pie charts. So they did a lot of their little mini studies between these three to see how the order was going to shake out. And every single time, angle produced the most error. Pie charts produced the most error. We're really bad at interpreting pie charts. Now, you show somebody a pie chart of 25/75, they're going to instantly recognize what you're talking about. But you show somebody a pie chart that's like, oh, 77/23, and they're going to have a much harder time interpreting those angles. Down below that, they said that we are the worst at area, volume, and curvature. So area is going to be like bubble charts. Volume is anything 3D. And curvature is where we get like donut charts and fancy graph types like that. We were so bad at interpreting these, at least back in 1984, that they ended up dropping these from some of their mini studies. Down with this group, they also put shading, which I have put off to the side because it's not so much a problem anymore. But back in '84, I'm sure some of you have like bad recollections of this, but the only way we had to show shading was this like crosshatch pattern fill. Yeah, we've since seen research that shows that causes optical illusions in our viewers, which is not what we're going for when we're presenting our data, right? Oh my gosh. So now the research shows that we can distinguish between about 4 shades of one color before things start to get tricky. So this is no longer the worst. It's somewhere else in this hierarchy. I don't know exactly where. But anyway, Cleveland and McGill say we should be trying to graph as high up in this hierarchy as possible because that's what our audience's brains can handle. So we take what they need, like what scenario we'll be in. We'll take what their brains can handle. And then we take the story that we need to tell, or the thing we need our audience to do when they're looking at our data. And this is what I'm covering mostly in my book. So let's just walk through a couple of options here. Let's talk about comparing two or more things. Probably the most common way that we show this is the side-by-side or clustered bar chart or column chart. And sure, it's fine. We are really good at interpreting the length of things. This is totally going to work when we're just comparing two things, like youth and adult. Because even though the research says we can compare length really well, we've also seen plenty of research that says we can't compare non-adjacent lengths. So this becomes a problem when we try to slice in like a third or fourth or fifth column in each one of these little groups. We're really bad at that. So that's why we need to have some other options. Let's look at some other options. Here's a newer graph type coming out these days. It's called a slope graph, and it's still comparing just two things. Here we're looking at beginning of the year and end of the year. But what slope graphs do better than any other graph type is they show how one thing went down when everything else went up, or one thing went up faster than all of the others. You see that in a slope graph in ways that you just cannot see in any other graph type. So that is the story that the slope graph supports the best. Here's another option. This is a connected dot plot. This is position on a common scale. It's dots on a line. It's the easiest thing, according to Cleveland and McGill, for us to interpret with accuracy. Now, it's a newer graph type, so some of you might be like, I'm not so sure. But that's because we're data nerds. We look at this stuff all day, and so we don't like new stuff like this. But you show this to people who are not data nerds, and they instantly recognize what we're talking about. So you could just have the dots. This one's a connected dot plot with the line between the two. That line really highlights the gap or the growth. So that's the story that this visual supports the best. And in this case, with this data set, we organized all of these categories from greatest to least according to that growth. And then we snuck in yet another comparison point by having this benchmark line going down the right-hand side. That's a great story to tell. Let's look at another story. Sometimes what we need to talk about are our survey responses. And again, I think the most common way I see people do this is with a column graph. Again, cool, we can judge the length of things, but it's difficult for us to tell that this adds up to 100%, isn't it? Like that we're talking about all of our survey respondents. So what people will often do is wrap it together into a stacked bar. Now it's much easier to see we're talking about parts of a whole here, aren't we? And stacked bars are going to be fine, but there are some criticisms people have. While it's easy for us to compare these dark blue strongly agree bars, because they line up on this baseline, it's much harder for us to compare the light blue agree bars because they don't share a common baseline at the beginning or at the end for us to judge what's going on in there. Some ways that you can make this easier for people to read, you can color code. It's something that Andy talked about and something that I'm showing you here. We have diverging colors on either side of our Likert scale and darker colors on the more strongly held feelings. That helps people mentally see what's going on a little bit better. You can also organize these and sort them so that they're going from greatest to least on one-year categories. Those things will help, but they're not entirely going to get rid of the problem. So that's why we have some other graph types at our disposal, like a diverging stacked bar. So in this visualization, the data share this baseline right down the middle between agree and disagree. Can you see it? And sometimes people really like to actually draw a line down there, which you could do if you wanted to. But that common baseline in the middle gives us the ability to compare those middle categories, and it lets us see how all of the disagrees shake out in comparison to one another. So a diverging stacked bar is a new option for us. Let's look at another. What about an aggregated bar? I really love this example because I used to do so many surveys. I was such a great survey methodologist, and we would ask questions with Likert scales that had like 7 or 9 or 11 points on it, which was great when we're trying to disaggregate and do our analysis. But really, really bad when we're trying to communicate that information out to other people, because our readers very rarely care about the difference between an 8 and a 9 on an 11-point scale. So how about we just aggregate some of those categories, and then we end up with fewer stacks in each one of our bars, and it's a bit easier to see what's going on inside. If those middle categories are really important, what about something like small multiples? Small multiples is where we have several small graphs all positioned right next to each other. And in this case, we can put each one of our stacks from our stacked bar on their own baseline. And here it's going to be much easier for us to care and analyze what's going on with that sort of category than it would be in any other graph type. I'm going to show you one more way to talk about survey data, and that's with a nested map. I love this visual so much because it's the best way to show our work whenever we have branching questions on our survey, whenever we're talking about subsets of subsets. The way that I used to do this in my old days of being a researcher is that we would just, kind of write about it in the narrative and just have independent graphs, and we would expect the audience to be tracking about the fact that we're talking about subsets of subsets. And that's a lot to ask. So in this case, we're able to put all of the data together into one visual. So we have 100% of our survey respondents taken up by the whole area here. And then the black box is the 75% who said yes and got the branch. Out of that group, 81% said daily. And out of that group who said daily, 64% said they use software, etc. So that you can see how this is nesting one inside the other. There's no better way to show when we're talking about of those who did this, X said this. This is the best way to do it. Now, what helps is if we use some color coding going on here, and if you keep your ends in there so that people can track how one numerator becomes the next denominator. Now, this is mapping by area, which, if you remember from a few slides ago, we're really bad at. So the trick, if you're going to do something like this, is that everything has to be mathematically proportionate. Like someone should be able to put down a ruler and measure that 81% square. And it needs to really, truly be 81% of the size of its parent yes square. So it requires some math. But you can do it because you get a great visual as a result. So I want to end with showing you one more example of what visualization can really do for us. Yeah, well, we're not quite there yet. You're looking at the before. I was working with a large foundation in the US who was calling this a dashboard. It's really just a spreadsheet. And they were giving it to their board of directors, and they came to me and they were like, Stephanie, our board is having a really hard time making decisions with our dashboard. I was like, you think? Yeah, nobody's brain can juggle that many pieces, that many numbers, and try to pull out any kind of meaningful patterns. So my suggestion was, well, let's skip this whole thing. We'll just make a big table, big page full of graphs, and we'll use that instead. And he said, no, 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 the board really wants to see every one of those raw numbers. I was like, no, they don't. But okay, sure, we'll keep it in there, sure. So here's what we did. I did change things like colors and fonts, but in terms of the visuals, I only added 3 tiny little visualizations in here. In the middle, you can see I've got these trend lines, and all they're doing is drawing out the pattern of the numbers that come before, because our brains can't really do that. Our brains have a hard time juggling that many bits. So we're just going to draw the picture in there. And I won't tell you much, but you will see if things are going up and down or what. There's a green dot at the end of those trend lines, and that's the target that they're aiming for in 2019. Now, all the red numbers have to be there, so the target is listed in the column next door. And you can see that some of those targets have these red dots. That is set up with a little bit of programming so that it will appear when, based on their current trend, there is no way they're going to make it to their target on time unless they intervene. Talk about actionable decision making. The board of directors was thrilled. And then we have these modified bar graphs off to the side that show how close we are, which is the black bar, to meeting the target, which is the gray bar. So they took this to the board of directors. They were so excited because they knew exactly where to intervene. There was a giant red dot in their face telling them where some action had to occur. So it became the most efficient, productive, action-oriented board meeting that they'd ever had. And it actually became a complete game changer for the entire foundation because they realized that if you present your data effectively, if you take care to visualize it well, you become a culture changer. So that's what we're going for. That's what Andy's talking about in his book, and that's what I'm teaching you how to do in my book.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and thank you, Andy, for your informative presentations. Now we're going to spend some time addressing some of the questions that we've received from the audience, and please continue to send those questions into the question box on the right side of your screen or on Twitter using hashtag MethodSpace. And I have one question for myself before we get going with the audience questions, and that is for an academic audience. Do either of you receive resistance from academic practitioners just because your things aren't sufficiently boring? And I'm wondering, Andy, if you could address that first.
the resistance I get from academic audiences tends to be more about the why? Show me the evidence, show me the evidence. The stuff that Stephanie's introduced there, the studies by Cleveland and McGill, are just one of the artillery that we have to respond to these absolutely legitimate questions. But yeah, in my experience, academics are generally, I mean, this is perhaps largely in the UK, but generally are always looking to find new ways in the culture of higher education at the moment to reach lay audiences in particular. And so if there's clearly some kind of innovative, inspirational, but ultimately effective approach that they can use, actually I find them to be quite open-minded to the potential of those, but they also want to know why. They also want to know why these things work and have enough evidence so that they can pass that on and kind of be comfortable in themselves taking on board these different practices.
I'll just add to that. I completely agree. I feel like academics really want to see the research, and so I've included lengthy research in both of my books specifically to support these points so that people don't think that, oh, it's just what me and Andy think makes a pretty graph. But I think the other drivers for academic culture are journals and funders. And while that's a slow tide to turn, it's turning, and some of my most recent clients have been the big funders. I just got an email yesterday from a journal editor asking for me to submit an article about data visualization because they're all becoming more and more aware that this has to change. And so I think when those expectations change, we'll see a larger change in academia too.
Andy, which of the 4 workflow stages that you showed takes the longest on average?
Generally speaking, so let's kind of eliminate. So the first and the third tend to be the shortest without question, because largely they are thinking tasks, gathering requirements in stage 1, ideas, speaking to colleagues, clients, quite quick. Editorial thinking can be quite quick. It tends to be a mixture between either the working with data stage or the design stage, and I would probably lean towards the data stage because there is so much hidden work that goes into, even actually into some of the most apparently simple visualizations. So much work goes into the gathering, the manually cleaning, analyzing, acquainting with tasks. So I would suggest that in some of my workflows I would estimate between 1/3 and 2/3 of my time will go on the data stage, and I would probably say about roughly half my time is dedicated to that stage alone, but it is always the hidden burden that we're facing.
Speaking of the kind of physical aspect of this, I'm wondering if both of you could talk about the software that you use to develop these visualizations. And Stephanie, I wonder if you could go first.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I work almost exclusively inside Excel. The only thing I didn't do in Excel here was the nested map because that was just inserting rectangles in PowerPoint. But I totally believe Office has the capabilities we need to do 90% of the visualizations that we need to do, and that's my book. It's showing you step by step how to build these things inside Excel.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Excel is, almost in spite of itself, is still a very powerful and important ally. You can do a lot more things than you can imagine, and I certainly do use Excel a lot still. It's been my tool of choice for 17, 18 years. I also use Tableau software extensively. I use Adobe Illustrator as the kind of final canvas for a lot of work to kind of create infographics. And there are one or two other tools that I use. There's a few tools that kind of just do one thing. And often you are looking at a repertoire of tools if you kind of want to broaden the repertoire of things you want to do. So a tool such as, or a web-based tool such as RAW, R-A-W, allows you to generate perhaps charts that you might not be otherwise given access to in Excel. So yeah, you are looking at kind of a typically kind of common 2 or 3, but there are many, many out there, and it's an evolving space. Things are becoming obsolete, are expiring, but there's also lots of new tools and expanded tools in this relatively contemporary field.
You know, we're often asked to present our data fairly simply, but we also don't want to be the boring that I had mentioned before. And I'm just wondering, is there any help in helping us kind of navigate between the overly ornate and the overly boring, once again? And Stephanie, I wonder if you might start with that.
Sure. Well, there's so many ways to go with this. I mean, part of it is just like don't be boring. Like, get up there and have fun. So maybe in the follow-up blog post we can include some links to this, but there are some great creative, really engaging, fun ways that I've presented very simple bar graph data with food, with candy, that can make what might be boring content really, really fun. Another strategy you might need is a really big metaphor for your story. I was working with someone recently who had to report on like Medicaid data, and he's like, how am I going to make this fun? And we talked about like, well, what is the giant metaphor that you could use for this that would make it more engaging? So sometimes it's not the graph itself. Sometimes a new data viz style isn't going to save your boat, but something else might.
Yeah, just to kind of follow up on that, it is, I guess, the real art form is to find that balance, to find that sweet spot. And the idea of those three principles that I've just been through, try and preserve, first of all, the importance and the paramount importance of trustworthiness. So no choice that you make should lie, should distort, as Stephanie mentioned, should distort through the miscalculation of area sizes. It should be accessible because any choice you make as well should not impede or obstruct the underlying content. But the elegance principle that I talked about, I feel gives you that room for manoeuvre, so long as you've nailed down the other two principles, gives you that room for manoeuvre to find a way to perhaps seduce an audience in ways that don't distort the story, don't distort the data, but maybe exploit the metaphors or the natural connotations of a subject. So all the methods that Stephanie just mentioned there, they are fun. They're not necessarily allowing you to read numbers, but that isn't the point of data viz really. Data viz should do something different to a table. And so if you can find a visual language that does allow you to engage a new audience, does allow them to give a feeling of numbers rather than just the reading of numbers, then you are on the right lines. But it is something that you really get through practice and exposure to different techniques and ideas, and we can be influenced and inspired by those outside the field, around the field, sorry, doing some incredible stuff.
And I don't mean to make this sound like it's a zero-sum game, but in general, should our visualizations really trying to hammer home a single point, or should it just be this very rich playground where you go and find various things out depending on your wants? And Stephanie, might you start with that?
Well, I think that depends so much on who your audience is, where you're going to be putting this, whether you're going to be there to be explaining it, or whether they're going to be looking at it on their own. So many contextual considerations are going to have to go into play there.
Yeah, and I mean, it's actually something that I personally struggle with, the discipline to keep the number of messages down. Because sometimes when I'm immersing myself in a subject and its data, I find some different aspects of interest that I want to kind of convey to others. But you almost have to put your mindset into that of the intended audience, and it's a very easily trot out line from us as designers. But if you were them, what would you want to know? What would you need to know? What wouldn't you really need to know? And so sometimes there are, of course, occasions where a single message is the key thing. In a boardroom setting, for example, you might want to get across a key message in 10 seconds. But actually, even in a small, simple data set, there are often so many different angles that you could portray things. And in the right circumstances, why not include many messages? Why not include interactivity that allows people to explore their own discoveries and not just let you take the responsibility yourself as the maker, but abdicate the responsibility rightfully to those who might be better placed to find their own answers?
Stephanie, kind of a granular question. Going back, you were talking about how you used almost Excel exclusively, but then you mentioned the nested maps. And I'm just wondering, what's the best way to ensure that those squares and rectangles are mathematically accurate?
Oh, honey, you have to get your calculator, and you have to calculate area. We're talking about length times width. I mean, like old school, third grade, make your brain sweat, like calculator stuff. And it's typically the hardest part of the workshop that we have because we all have to do so much math. But that's how you know you're making something that's trustworthy and accurate.
Well, I'm crushed to find out I have to work at this too. I'm wondering too, I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on, and then something that Andy brought up just a moment ago about online and interactive data visualizations. And Andy, since I cited you, why don't you go first?
Yeah, sure. So obviously, this is the rich canvas that we now have, desktop, laptop, mobile, tablet, this is kind of where we are looking, this is where we are finding, sharing and accessing this kind of content. Now, my view is that, of course, interactivity unlocks so much more potential in allowing the readers, the audience, the users, however you want to term that role, to interrogate, to manipulate, to find a way to customize the experience for them, whether it's a curiosity they have or whether it's a certain piece of data that they can put into and participate with a visualization to make sense of where they fit into the world. I guess my caution on this is often the case that it should add value. Again, it should tick the boxes of those principles that I've talked about, because too often I see projects that actually impede the understanding from a visualization because there are too many clicks. There are too many obstacles to go through to choose the thing that you're actually interested in. And so my advice is always exhaust the possibilities of an effective static solution before you then start to give the task to a reader, a user, to engage and interact with the buttons and the features and the functions that you create. They can, of course, add so much richness, undeniably, but they should do so with value.
Yeah, and I echo that completely. I've seen, like, I would just want people to think about what is the tool that is going to be most appropriate for my needs right now. I've seen people jump to interactive when it's like too much for what they actually have to show. I was just looking at a client's interactive visualizations yesterday with the option to show it as a line graph, a bar graph, and the map, and it was only one data point. I mean, one number. You don't need 3 different graph types for that, and you certainly don't need to let people click between them. So a simple static visual was all they really needed. In fact, adding that interactivity just made it worse.
So a lot of times we end up using tables and things like that because we know and understand them, and it's just a template that we can use to kind of flow in data that we have. So I'm wondering, do you guys have, when you create your data visualizations, do you do it from scratch each time, or do you have defaults and templates that maybe are a little whizzier than the ones we're used to, but that you can go to all the time? And Stephanie, let's start with you.
Sure. So I have an Excel file that has, like 1 graph type per tab, and I recommend people make this for themselves so that you only really have to go through the process of making a dot plot once, and then you can just go in and add new numbers when your data set changes. And that generally works. Another strategy, if you have to do this in mass, is to start looking at code and macros, because that will help you do things much, much quicker. But I almost never use just the defaults. And we need to get used to this fact that the defaults cannot do the thinking for us. They cannot do the storytelling for us. So we're always going to have to do some manipulation of what the software platform spits out, regardless of what it is.
Yeah, and just going to add to that, I should do. I don't, to be honest, very often. I often just sit there and think, oh, which project did I do this on previously, and then run around all my files inefficiently. So yeah, it is a practice, a habit that I should get more proactive with, having these kind of off-the-shelf templates ready to go with. Obviously, each project I work on will often have a different ingredient, which perhaps renders those less useful than actually starting from scratch. But if it is something, as Stephanie mentioned, that it will be repeatable, a monthly report, for example, then yeah, if you can get it right once, do the thinking, do the setup, thereafter it becomes a data tweaking thing, and you'll be much more efficient in your publication and production cycle.
So how do some of the techniques that you're talking about differ, or maybe they don't differ, depending on whether you're doing it in either online print or if you're doing it in person? I mean, how do they change? Yeah,
I can respond to this first of all. The big difference. So when I introduced the definition of visualization that I use, one of the layers of design was annotation, and this is the layer of assistance, the captions, the introductions, the pointers, the things that would say on a piece of paper or on a screen, how to read it, what's it all about, and where are the key things that are of interest. Now, when you're in person, you actually verbally annotate, and so you actually can remove all that potential clutter from a screen, from a display, and you can actually verbalize that. I always refer to the example of Al Gore rising on his cherry picker to show that famous chart that rose in The Inconvenient Truth. everyone in visualization is obliged at some point to mention Hans Rosling in a webinar. And Hans Rosling famously talked about, almost like a horse racing commentary, this motion of a bubble chart over time. So when we are there in person, we can talk people through, we can coach people through what we think is most relevant for them to pick up.
And I'll just add to that. I think one of the things that you can do in person that you can't always get away with in print or online is to drip the content a little bit more so that you're really presenting one idea at a time. If you think about it, in person, you're up there talking. They're also supposed to be looking at a screen. The room is too cold. They've got an itch. I mean, there's a million things going on in their head. The last thing we want to do is overwhelm them with a ton of data all at once. So my best strategy when I'm showing information in person is to present one bit at a time, like bring in one line on the line graph at a time and talk about it or say what I need to say, make my point before I move on to the next one. And that's really helpful for people who are more data scared, who aren't nerds like us, who don't look at graphs all day.
We haven't talked a lot about what I guess we would call infographics, which are they're not as data rich. I mean, that's generally how I interpret them. And I'm just wondering, do you use an infographic in combination with charts to enhance presentations, or are infographics just too loud to begin with? Stephanie, why don't you start?
Oh man, I was going to boot this to Andy because I don't want to talk about infographics.
I'll take this one. I'll take this, Stephanie. Yeah, don't worry. I'll pick up the baton. Yeah. So my view about infographics is perhaps favourable because I know that the purest form of infographics is almost the best form of this game. Over the last maybe 5 years, we've had such a clutter of bad, trashy, 640 pixels wide, 1 million pixels long infographics that are effectively fast food in visualization form. Infographics in their original intention combine charts, data-driven charts, with media, imagery, photographs, text, flowcharts, information, graphics. So they are definitely part of the repertoire of options for how you create and how you convey your work. And as I said, in their finest form, they're not too loud. They are not gratuitous. They actually do provide value in the space that they kind of presenting the content. So they're just one extra part of the artillery that we're faced with.
And I'll just add to that. I think it was Alberto Cairo, another great DataViz author, who told me that infographics should tell a story. And I think that's what you mean, Andy, when you're talking about the ones in their original form. Like, think about the visuals you might see in a National Geographic story.
Exactly.
They should tell a story from beginning to end. The current incarnation of infographics that's just like this eye candy in your face, not connected, just a bunch of numbers slapped onto a page, it just doesn't work. It doesn't tell a story.
So Stephanie, harking back to that one chart you showed that had the little red dots for action items, that was really impressive. But in academic research, we're usually not allowed to use colors in publication. We have to go back to Andy's age of the crosshatch. And I'm just wondering, what do we think about using only black and white graphs? Does that limit our options in conveying a great deal of information, or are we just not being creative enough?
No,
Andy,
no,
why don't you go? Oh, go ahead,
okay.
Stephanie. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I was just going to say, I think we have to pay attention to that, and I mean, because connected to the black and white issue is a colorblind issue. So we have to be thinking about both at the same time, even if we're not going to be printing in a black and white environment. In my example with my red dots, those things are going to show up as black, and they're still going to be noticeable and big black dots in your face. They're not dots on every single number, and that's a mistake people often make. They'll put red dots, yellow dots, green dots, and then when it's reprinted in black and white, or we're showing it to somebody with red-green color blindness, they can't tell what's going on. So I think we can still be incredibly selective and be aware that what we're doing is going to work in black and white or a grayscale environment.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I mean, once again, acquainting things to photography, we can still convey through photographs in black and white form depth and shade and light and form and pattern. And the monochrome spectrum of shades gives us actually quite a lot of variation to work with. We can create things that will be prominent in the foreground, we can push things into the background, and then we can double them up with position, with shape, with size, different encodings that allow us to vary the content that we can display. So of course it is a limiter, it is a constraint, but it is still something that allows us to express ourselves visually, albeit without that colour channel.
This has been really fun, but sadly we're coming down to the close, and we've got coming down to our last question. And this is kind of a big one, though. Well, everything that we've talked about has had kind of a quantitative aspect to it. There have been numbers that have really driven it. But what about people that are doing qualitative research, and they have findings that they want to do, and they don't want to just do it as just one giant block of text? I mean, what sort of tips can you offer for qualitative data visualization?
I'm happy to kick off, Stephanie. So textual visualization, qualitative visualization, I think is still an emerging field. And I've been doing a few sessions this week where we have had qualitative researchers looking for solutions. My immediate and perhaps lazy opinion on this is that actually a lot of qualitative data can still be very very sensitively expressed in quantitative and categorical and relational form. So when I'm dealing with textual data, commonly I'll be looking to find ways to quantify strength of feeling, instance of a word being used, the sentiment attached to that word. Things like natural language programming can help us convert the use of language into some kind of semantic meanings or hierarchies. The position of text in a script can mean something. The mention of certain themes. There's been a lot of work done by the newspapers. Every January there's usually a new release of a State of the Union analysis about the themes that are being talked about in the script by the President. So actually a lot of it involves transforming the qualitative data into these categories, these instances, these sentiments, these counts, these strengths and these relationships to then use the same techniques that you would otherwise use with quant data to portray them visually.
Completely agree, Andy. So many of the same strategies we're talking about, like using action colors and things like that, will completely apply to qualitative visualization. I have a whole chapter on this in my book, but the bottom line, the short answer is to just diagram it. All of this stuff fits together. All of the things that you're talking about, all of your themes all fit together in some way. Draw it out. So I usually will open up PowerPoint and insert arrows and circles and some text boxes, and I will actually diagram what I'm talking about here, or use photographs, but you can visualize this stuff. Unfortunately, there is no like just make it into a bar chart because qualitative data is so broad. But just give it a shot. Get out some pencil and paper and try to draw it.
Yeah, and just to kind of just wrap up that point, it effectively taps into perhaps the broader field of information design, not just data-driven design, but information design. And so exactly as Stephanie said, you're looking to kind of sketch out the actors, the entities, the transactions, the relationships, the influences, the events, the sequences. And so these are all still using the same palette as we use in data-driven visualization, but it's not that there's a pre-prepared template ready for that stuff.
Well, I think that's about all the time we have for today, although it's been a fascinating conversation and I'd love to continue. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and I want to offer a special thanks to our speakers, Andy Kirk and Stephanie Evergreen. Now, if you do want to continue the conversation, as you can see on the screen, we're offering a code, EvergreenKirk20. That's all. You can see it on the screen. It's both the last names of our speakers and 20, all one word, for a 20% discount if you'd like to purchase their books from sagepub.com or from sagepub.co.uk. From either of those websites. They're both from Sage Publishing. And again, those books are Stephanie's book, Effective Data Visualization, The Right Chart for the Right Data, and Andy's Data Visualization, A Handbook for Data-Driven Design. And in the coming weeks, be on the lookout for an email for registered users that includes a link to view the entire webinar and slides again. And on that blog post, we'll see if there might be some other information that we can include about data visualization that might be useful. And please stay connected with us on MethodSpace and on the Sage Connection blog for information about upcoming webinars. And once again, I want to give a big thank you to our technical crew and also to Andy and Stephanie. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.